During a 2007 Steelers game in Denver, safety Ryan Clark started to experience severe pain in his left side. What was ultimately happening was something that could have cost the star player his life. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and my goal in this channel is to teach you about the medical side of this sports world. This video is going to be all about sickle cell trait and what exactly happened with Ryan Clark during that fateful game in Denver in 2007. To understand sickle cell trait and disease, we first have to talk about this guy. This is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that's found in our red blood cells that is responsible for transporting oxygen throughout our body. In our genetics, we get one copy of the hemoglobin gene from our mom and one from our dad, and that determines the structure and function of this ever-important protein. With sickle cell disease, both copies of that gene are abnormal, but with sickle cell trait, only one, which often is something that doesn't get discovered unless tested because most individuals lead pretty normal, healthy lives. Our normal red blood cells have this disc kind of flat shape to them where they can move nice and smooth throughout all of our blood vessels without getting caught or stuck in the small little capillaries throughout our body and throughout our organs. When you have sickle cell disease, meaning two copies, your red blood cells are abnormally shaped. The hemoglobin protein forms these strands inside the red blood cells, and you get this classic kind of sickling appearance where they get flat, they get sharp, they get pointy on the ends, hence why we call it sickle cell disease. These sickle cell RBCs trying to travel through your bloodstream can get easily caught, and when they get caught, they plug up the blood supply to the tissue and to your organs, which is what causes all of the serious complications of having sickle cell. Now, with someone like Clark, who had just sickle cell trait, you have pretty normal looking red blood cells, and oftentimes, unless you're tested, you don't really ever understand or know that you have this unless there's some complication. But that's where playing in Denver in 2007 started all this off, because of the altitude and the effect on his blood cells. Let's talk about that fateful day in Denver and what was happening in his physiology, plus kind of the subsequent treatment. But first, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video. Today's video is sponsored by Mando, the makers of whole body deodorant for your pits, packages, feet, and more. Mando was created by a doctor who saw how BO is being misdiagnosed and mistreated. Body odor can have a huge negative effect on your quality of life and well-being, and so Mando's got you covered with everything you need. And Mando's starter pack is a great way to get started. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, or an acidified cleansing bar, and 2 free products. I chose some mini deodorant wipes and an acidified body wash. And right now, Mando's going to hook you up by using code BRIANMD at checkout and clicking the link down in the description. You're going to get $5 off, which is about 40% off that starter pack plus free shipping today. If you're worried about smells in your private parts, Mando is clinically proven to control odor better than a shower with soap alone. 12 hours after a shower, your stink level down there might be a 5 out of 10, but with Mando, that's coming all the way down to a 0. You can choose from 4 different scents like bourbon leather, Mount Fuji, my personal favorite, the Pro Sport, Clover Woods, or even an unscented variety. Mando doesn't stain your clothes, and whether it's their deodorant stick or the invisible cream deodorant, you're not gonna have any leftover residue or visible signs that you've got it on your skin. So start smelling better all across your body by checking out Mando, code BRIANMD at checkout. Use the link down in the description for $5 off your starter pack and free shipping. Mile High Stadium, of course, gets its name because of the altitude. At over 5,000 feet above sea level, when you get into a higher altitude, there's less abundance of oxygen in the air. And that's important for sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease, because whenever you have decreased oxygen in the air, decreased oxygen in your blood, that hypoxia, that we call it, can trigger those red blood cells to start to sickle, even in the case of somebody who has sickle cell trait and not the full-blown sickle cell disease. This isn't anything specific to Denver, it's just that happens to be, I believe, the highest elevation stadium in the NFL, and so something where you would never think it, you would never know it, until you end up in this high altitude situation where the oxygen is lower, and that can trigger this sickle cell crisis. As the available oxygen in the atmosphere starts to go down, your body becomes hypoxic, and that hypoxia triggers that hemoglobin protein to start to develop this sickling type of shape. So your red blood cells start off nice and normal appearance, moving nice and smooth throughout your bloodstream, but as you get to high altitude, your oxygen levels start to drop, your red blood cells start to sickle, and that triggers this sickle crisis, which is what Ryan Clark ultimately experienced. The different effects depend on which particular organ are implicated in the downstream damage. Clark ultimately had to have his spleen removed because of likely a spleen infarction or death of his spleen. If you look at our biodigital anatomy tool here in the organs, of course, the liver, which can also be implicated in a sickle cell crisis, and I believe Clark said he even had part of his liver removed, The liver sits kind of right upper quadrant of the abdomen. You then are going to have the kidneys, which sit in the backside, one on the left, one on the right. Again, very abundant blood supply to the kidneys, trying to filter out the blood, and so the kidneys can also be affected with this sickling crisis. But then the spleen, which sits in the left upper abdomen. And there's been football players, there's been athletes who have had just spleen lacerations or spleen injuries because of direct trauma, contact to the rib cage, causing that densely packed vascular spleen to tear, to rip, to bleed. But in the case of a sickle cell crisis, like what Clark experienced at altitude, as those red blood cells start to sickle, they get clogged up inside the blood vessels, and therefore you don't get blood continuing through into this tissue. The spleen is extremely vascular. It's really important for kind of filtering our blood, storing some of the white blood cells. It's really important with our immune system, with how it produces blood cells and antibodies. And so the spleen is getting a lot of blood flow going to it. If you have sickling that occurs, you don't get blood supply to the spleen, and the spleen starts to die. As the spleen dies, we call that a spleen infarction, and it begins to get to a point where you can't reverse it, and the only thing you can do is basically remove the spleen, because as that tissue dies, it can become necrotic, it can become infected, and basically becomes non-functioning. So in the case of Clark, he had to have his spleen removed because those sickling red blood cells caused blood loss and damage to the tissue of the organ, rendering it basically useless. A lot of people with sickle trait, sickle disease, will have other issues with kidney problems because of the constant kind of micro-infarctions, small levels of impaired blood supply that can cause death. And even as Clark said, part of the liver had to be cut out. The challenge then afterwards is that your spleen is really important for your immune system. And so one of the important things in medicine, if somebody undergoes a spleen resection or a splenectomy, is you have to get a lot of different vaccines to help protect against organisms that can be implicated if you don't have a well-functioning spleen. And so while, yes, you could say it decreases your chance of having another complication with the sickle cell just to the spleen, there are a lot of other life challenges and complications that occur after you've undergone that removal of your spleen. If you have severe enough effects from these sickle cell crises where a lot of your organ systems get damaged, then absolutely this is something that can be fatal. And it's not just high altitude that makes us think of this. It's actually required now for NCAA Division I athletes, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender, to get tested for sickle cell trait because we need to be aware of it whenever we're having athletes that are potentially having symptoms that could explain by sickle cell crisis. Simply having one copy of the abnormal gene or sickle cell trait is not a disqualifier from participating in sports, and you just have to consider if you're going to be at altitude, you have to be more cautious. You might decide to not have an athlete participate if they've had issues in the past, because exercise can also be a trigger for one of these sickle cell crises. So it's great to see now that Clark is a big advocate for getting testing, hopefully a cure for something like this, and just trying to spread awareness of what can happen in these individuals. It is definitely more common in African-American individuals than Caucasian, but we still test everybody, and it's still something to be aware of in the entire population. I love that Mike Tomlin wouldn't let him play in subsequent games in Denver, even though Clark tried to. This is a great situation for a coach and not just the medical staff stepping up and saying, hey, we're going to be responsible for our athletes. We're not going to let them put themselves in situations where maybe they don't fully grasp the risk or at least can't remove themselves from that situation to make a good decision. And so good on Mike Tomlin for not letting him play in Denver going forward. And I'm sure to this day, he's mindful about what he does at altitude, or if he even goes to altitude, especially then with exercise involved. So that's it for the video, everybody. Thank you as always for watching. Let me know any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.